issue. Driving slavery, though, at its core is an economic one. The South was dependent on slave labor for these cash crops, and so John Quincy Adams is angering them with these tariffs and all these other things are happening at the same time. So it's their last chance to make a stand against federal encroachment. And like I said, economic hardship is happening in the South because of the tariffs, which really hurt farmers. So the first state to take a stand is going to be, it's going to be South Carolina. They're going to take the lead in the protesting. And John Calhoun, in secret, is going to write something called the South Carolina Exposition, okay? Also known as Calhoun's Protest. It was written by John Calhoun. He's the vice president at the time. He can't openly write it because he's in a position of power and he's, sleeping next door to the president, as it were. And so he writes this and he denounces the tariff as being unjust and unconstitutional. And so Calhoun's Protest, again, the South Carolina Exposition, becomes known really for its threat. Okay, South Carolina threatens to secede from the Union if the tariff is not repealed. And so this was inspired sort of from another idea that we talked about a while back called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. So let's sort of look at the basis for that. Again, the South Carolina Exposition takes its motivation from the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. And to recap, if you don't remember what those were, remember these are the resolves that were against the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, the Federalists were trying to restrict who could become citizens, who could vote. And so people in the South were less educated. Most immigrants, when they came, were less educated. They were going to be anti-Federalist if and when they could become citizens. And so the Federalists, way back when, tried to prevent this from happening so the balance of power didn't tip. And so the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves, they were challenged as being unconstitutional. They stayed in place. But now we have a South Carolina Exposition, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to challenge the constitutionality of this new tariff. Okay, so this new exposition, the South Carolina Exposition, is going to now say that states should nullify the tariff within their own borders. So South Carolina is not going to pay this tax to, or they're not going to take part in this tariff, which is going to cause other countries to pay more taxes. And again, this goes back to the theory of nullification, that states can invalidate unconstitutional federal laws, basically saying that if states don't like something because it goes against the Constitution, if it's not explicitly expressed in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, then states don't have to follow this federal law. They can actually invalidate it. And so it becomes a very scary time. And again, this is all kind of foreshadowing the secession that's going to precede the Civil War. Again, Calhoun, he's from the South. He's a Unionist. He wants to keep us together, but he's also a nationalist. He wants to expand and have national pride, but he's also a Southern sectionalist. So he's going to protect his constituents. And this is one of the things that they care about most is their economic well-being. Okay. And so this South Carolina Exposition takes place. John Calhoun, again, is the one who wrote it. He wanted to protect the minority in the South from the tyranny of the majority in the North and the West. However, this South Carolina Exposition was just a threat and nothing happened to it. It was a false alarm. No other state joined South Carolina in protest. Who knows what would happen if another state had, but it did foreshadow secession that was to come not too far away from now, actually. So let's talk about the election of 1898. Okay, so 4 years after John Quincy Adams becomes president, really, this election began the day after this corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Okay, it began in February of 1825. This is 4 years of revenge, sort of campaigning for Andrew Jackson. After the election, it caused the Democrat Republicans to split. Now you have two distinct parties. You're going to have the Nationalist Republicans, which are going to be the John Quincy Adams side, and then you're going to have the Democrat Party, which is the Andrew Jackson side. Okay, and the Democrat Party, their rallying cry again is going to be the corrupt bargain and all hail Old Hickory. So these sort of slogans are going to start immediately after the election of 1824. So In this election, there's a ton of mudslinging. Again, the idea is, should the people rule, or should the president pick and choose who he wants to support him if they help him out? So people weren't happy with the way that John Quincy Adams was elected. Again, he only got a third of the popular vote. Okay, so there's going to be lots and lots of mudslinging in this particular election, and a lot of it's aimed towards John Quincy Adams. One of the interesting anecdotes was that he bought a chess set and a billiard table, like pool, with his own money. And Andrew Jackson and his supporters said that he was buying gambling tables and he was buying furniture for the presidential palace. So this is kind of a negative against John Quincy Adams for no reason. The biggest and saddest mudslinging was against Andrew Jackson and his wife. His wife was named Rachel Donaldson. The problem was Andrew Jackson and his wife, when they got married, Rachel Donaldson had not finalized her divorce yet. She thought it was finalized. Her ex-husband had not signed the papers yet. So she was being criticized as being an adulteress, that she was some kind of harlot, and you can't have a harlot, sinner, adulteress as the first lady in the White House. It was pretty nasty. It was pretty nasty. Jackson himself was criticized for being a slave trader. And so it got kind of nasty. At one point, they even had duels between Jackson and others who criticized his wife. And the sad part is, his wife actually died before the election took place. People say she died of a broken heart. You can Google it if you want to research more exactly how she died, but she did die. And one of the duels that happened to defend her honor was between Jackson and a man we talked about before. His name was John Sevier, or Sevier. Okay, he was the governor of the state of Franklin, and we talked about that way back when. He had said some negative things about Andrew Jackson's wife, and so Andrew Jackson went out there. This time, though, the duel happened like it was supposed to happen, and nobody fired at each other. They fired like into the air, and then they hugged each other and said, "My bad." But still, this sort of illustrates the mudslinging that was happening in this election of 1828. So even after all this, Andrew Jackson wins overwhelmingly, especially in the West and the South. John Quincy Adams polled about 44% of the vote, which is fairly respectable, much better than he did last time. But Andrew Jackson becomes our president. So what's important about John Quincy Adams? After he loses the election of 1828, he went on to serve as a member of the House of Representatives for 17 years. And he famously quoted as saying, "No person can be degraded by serving the people." So he served for 17 years. He was an old man by the time he was a representative. And in 1841, he actually defended some slaves. And this is depicted in the movie Amistad. It was about slaves who actually were taken from Africa, and they were brought to the New World illegally, because at the time it was still, the British slave trade was illegal. And so at this time, the only way you could be a slave is if you were born into slavery. And so John Quincy Adams was selected to sort of defend these slaves and prove that they were in fact from Africa. And this happened 7 years before he died. So this happened in 1841. John Quincy Adams died at the age of 80 in 1848. So it is depicted in the movie Amistad. I'm sure it's true in real life too, that John Quincy Adams was notorious for sort of sleeping during meetings of the House of Representatives. But he did sort of serve out his usefulness as a politician more in the House than he ever did as a president. Okay. So what's important about this election of Jackson? Democracy is spreading. It's a source of pride to say that you come from humble beginnings, and that's what Jackson was. Many felt that he was the best person to lead the country because of his success fighting the Indians and fighting the British in the War of 1812. Remember, this is the Battle of New Orleans that Jackson is so famous for. So a lot of people look to sort of these populist candidates, a man of the people to lead, instead of, these aristocrats who own land and happen to be rich. Funny. Okay. So again, even though this is happening, we still have we have sort of a split. We've got the wealthy in the North, and we have the sort of ruralness and poor of the South and the West. So we have some some splits in parties. We talked about the Democrat Republicans and the Democrats. So most of the high offices were led by leading citizens, but they had to get the common man's vote. Okay, this kind of sounds familiar. Our last few presidential elections, these are rich and powerful people, but they need the populist vote. And again, we've got two ideas here. We've got Jeffersonian democracy. These are the Democrat Republicans. People should be governed as little as possible, sort of small government idea. And then we have Jacksonian democracy, which is that people should rule directly. Okay, we're going to stop here for now, and we're going to pick up our next video lecture with Jacksonian democracy 2. Deuces.